Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking on CSS, but focusing more on CSS. But along the duration of this course, right, we could introduce something, even if it's not in the video. Let's say like maybe it's something from the previous video, previous topic, or previous two topics. We could bring it in and throw a new more light to it, and then add it if we need it for that video, and then explain it to in line with that video. So in this case, for instance, there's a new kind of tag we want to include from HTML. We could include it, explain it, and then we'll continue with CSS, right? So basically, what is CSS? CSS is what you can use to actually style a website, give it colors and all of that. So there are three ways you could basically do that. You could either do that using um, internal, right? So there's inline, internal, and external. So basically, what's external, right? It's just like you write. Let's say you pick up a piece of paper and you write all the styling you want a particular wardrobe, the wardrobe you are creating or the carpenter is creating to have, right? You're creating a wardrobe, you're making a wardrobe, and the wardrobe doesn't have that color, but immediately you pick up a rope and tie it on a piece of paper and you attach it to the wardrobe has that color. Once you remove the rope from the wardrobe doesn't have the color anymore. That is external, right? So you could have 4 or 5 wardrobes that have ropes tied to the same paper and they would all have the same color on those wardrobes, right? Or the same style, the same texture, whatever you wrote on the paper. But immediately you remove those ropes from each of those wardrobes, the wardrobes will begin to lose those styling. That's external. So what was internal? So internal is more like, let's say, for instance, that piece of paper, right? You carry it and you paste it on the wardrobe, maybe using a gum or sellotape or something. That wardrobe will have that styling as long as it's actually on it, right? So if you take that same piece of paper, you take another paper and write whatever you wrote on that piece of paper and you put it on another wardrobe, it's going to have the same thing. But there are two different pieces of paper. So that's how internal works, right? So when you put internal goes in between these head tags here, right? It goes there. That's how internal works. External, you attach to an external file, right? And then what is inline? Inline is basically when you like style on the element or the tag itself, right? That's how inline works. But let's first start with internal. Right, so how do we put internal styling? We put a style tag like this. You can see that it closed it, right? And there are basically ways you can actually pick up things you want to style. So you want to, if it's a wardrobe, you want to style the wardrobe. So that's how it is. So let's assume I actually want to style this header. There are so many ways I could do it, but for the sake of this video, we're going to stick to 3 ways. We're going to stick to selector. The type of selectors we'll stick to. We're going to stick to element, ID, and class. That's what we're basically going to stick to. So how do you select an element, this element here, by, how do you select it by element? How do you select this, by the element name? So if you want to select it, let's say we put header and we do this. So we have selected this header, right? So whatever we apply to right here is going to apply across board to the header. So if I say background color, and I say aqua, right? So I do this and let's go back to the website. I refresh this website. You can see that the color is actually, for the home page, is actually this, the background color, right? So that's how you can actually select by element, right? The element name. So let's assume something. Let's look at the practical example now. Let's look at another example. Now let's look at this, right? So if I actually want to select this H1, I could come and say H1 and do this, and I could say color, I could say red, right? And when I go to the website, right, you can see that the color changed to red, right? So this is called a property, right? And this is like the value, right? So basically, it's like you're setting the property of that particular thing, to that value. Okay, so let's look at something now. This is how you can select something by the element. So but let's do something. Let's, in this, the home page, let's create another paragraph and say a new section paragraph, right? So if we do something, we'll come and put P here and we'll say color green. Let's watch what's going to happen. right? If we come to the website, you will notice that all the places that has a P has now become green, right? But what about if that's not what we want to achieve? What about if it's just this new paragraph that we created that we want to have that P? How do we actually do it, right? So we can do it in several ways, but we're sticking to elements, ID, and class. So we give it something called class, and we say equal to. So we give it ID. We give it something called ID. So that paragraph is going to have that unique ID, right? And let's just say new P. Just give it new P, right? And then we come here. So if we want to select that paragraph, right? If it's only that paragraph, we want to give that green color and we want to select it. How do we do that? We start with the hashtag first, then we put the value, and then we save. So when we come back here and we refresh, you notice that it's only the paragraph that is going to have that color, right? So let's assume we actually want, let's say there are two paragraphs, right? There are two paragraphs that we want on the web page to actually have a similar chorus. Let's say let's just put P2, right? Okay, now there are two ways. The way we're going to do it now, we're going to use class. So let's say we want a group of paragraphs to have the same name, the same color, but not all paragraphs. So if we give it class and we say, let's say class, let's just say PS, right? Let's just say PS, and then let's change this to class equal to PS, right? So if we want to select those paragraphs by class, right, all we do is we put a dot and then we give it the value here, so PS. So when we do this, you will see what will happen. This is a paragraph, this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph, and this is a paragraph. And watch what's going to happen. You will notice that these two paragraphs have that color, but this doesn't have the color and this doesn't have that color. And that's because of this, right? So that's how you can actually do something like that on HTML. Now let's look at inline. If for instance I wanted we give H1 here, right? I wanted this particular paragraph to have a certain color and I wanted it to just be on that line, so I would use the style, right? And then I'll do this. I'll give it a property and value. Let's say color orange, right? You can see that by the time I refresh the page, you can see that this particular one has a color of orange. So basically that's how inline and internal works. So let us quickly do external. So what is external, right? If you come to let's click on about, you notice that the about page doesn't have those things. You notice that the contact page doesn't have those, but you have the home has those things. But let's assume I wanted the about page and the contact page to have those, some of these stylings too, right? To apply, just like the example of the wardrobe I gave, 4 wardrobes attached to the same paper. I would use something, I could actually copy this and paste it on all those individual pages. But I could also do something, right? I could literally just create an external CSS file and then append that file to all of them. So let's quickly do that. I want to create a folder first. Let's create a folder. I will call it CSS because I want all my CSS files to go in there. And inside that CSS folder, I'm going to create a new folder there, right? A new file there, and I'm going to name it, let's just name it my style.css. It's going to have the .css extension, right? And then I save that. So if I do that, right, I can basically copy all of these, right? Or let's still leave that there for the sake of this video so that you understand what it's all about. But let's do something now. Let's say the footer, right? Let's style the footer on that place. So if we say footer, right, we say footer, and then we say background color, we say black, and then we say color, we say white, right? So now let's go and attach that file to that page. So if you want to actually link an external CSS file, what do? We use the link, right? We use the link tag, and then we say ref, which is points to the link of the location of the file. So I would say CSS, right? Because that's the folder, and I would say my style.css, and I would say rel equal to style sheet, right? and I'll say type equal to text slash CSS, specifying that it's actually a CSS file, right? And look at this, it's here. So we're going to be expecting the background color to be black and the color to be white. So let's go back. So you can see that the background color is black and the color is white. So immediately I copy this line of code, but if we come here, we come to about, you can see that it doesn't apply here and this, but immediately I copy this line of code and I paste it in the about, the contact page, right? I save and I paste it in the about page and I save. What is going to happen? You can see that it's now in the contact page, you can see that it's now in the about page, and it's also in the home page too, right? So basically that's how internal, inline and external works, right? So let's do other things. Let's look at some other properties that we could actually work on, right? So let's look at some very important aspects of CSS. So let's go to CSS units. And how does CSS units work, right? So there are basically ways you can use to specify length, sizes, and other measurements of CSS. But for the sake of this video, we'll just stick to a few, right? We'll just stick to pixel, right? We'll play around with quite a few of them, but we'll just show you what it looks like. But I personally use pixel, and I might end up using that most of the time, but we'll show you how some of them works, right? So let's do something. Let's come back to the index.html, right? Let's come back to the index.html, and let's say style. Now let's do something. Let's say we say font size, right? Which font size, which is the size of the font of that place? Let's say 30 pixel. Now pixels are basically the tiny dots on your screen. You can't really see them, but they're like tiny dots on your screen. So we're saying that if you want 30 pixels, we're saying that okay, take 30 of those dots, right, and make it that, something like that, of that nature. So if we save and we come back here and refresh, you notice that it has gotten bigger. So pixel is one way you can actually give things, colors, size like that, right? Let's look at another property. Let's say width, and we say 300 pixels. Watch what happens. So when we do this and we refresh, you can see that the length has reduced, right? So basically that's how you can actually select all of that. We can even see height, and when we see height, let's say 300 pixel, right? So let's do that and we save. You can see that it has done that, right? So basically that's how that actually works. Let's look at other ones, right? Let's say percentage. Let's say 80%, 80%, and then let's save. You see what happens. It's going to take off 80% of the page, right? So let's look at another one again that we can work with. Let's look at okay, let's skip this. Let's look at EM, right? So we're looking at EM. Let's say 1.3 EM. You can see that when I hit this, so you can see that. So with this, let's make this. Let's just make this 20 pixels, and then let's make this to 2.5 EM, and let's see how that goes. So you can see this, it reduced the height, so 50 pixels, so we can see that properly. So you can see that it increased the font size, right, by that. There's also inches. Let's look at inches, right? Let's look at inches. But before we look at inches, let's look at points. So if we say 20 pt, right? You can see that, right? Let's also look at inches. Let's say 2 inches for the width, right? Alright, so you can see how all that works, right? So let's look at some other key things like margins, paddings, before we go into positioning, right? So let's look at margin, right? So let's give this 100%. So let's look at margin, right? So margin this is how margin works, right? So when we have, let's come back to this web page so that we can understand it better. So imagine, right, this this is the header and this is the nav, right? So let's this to make it better. Let's say let's first do something. Let's say header, right? So let's say header, let's give it a border 1 pixel, right? 1 pixel solid is the type of border, and let's say black, right? And then let's say nav, we say nav, and then we say let's give the nav a border of 1 pixel solid, and let's say brown, right? So it's going to give it a border 1 pixel thick, solid type of border, and then border brown. So if you look at this, right, you can see, so margin is basically the space between the nav and the header, right? And then padding is basically the space between elements inside an element, like that. That's the simplest way that can be put. So if we say, if we do something now, we say, let's say the header, let's say margin bottom, I would say 20 pixel, right? And then let's give it, so let's save this and see what it looks like. So if you look at this, you can see that there's space in between the two of them, right? And then let's look at, let's say padding, let's say padding bottom, I'll say 20 pixels. What is going to happen? You can see that there's more space in it. So that's literally what padding and margin are all about, right? So let's quickly look at positioning of elements. I'm just going to explain one basic one, which is absolute positioning, right? So when you give something an absolute positioning, right, this is how absolute positioning works. It's basically like when you it takes absolute position, it takes an element out of the normal flow, right, and positions it relative to its closest position ancestor. So this is how this works, right? Let's assume we give this, we say position, and we say absolute, right? What is going to happen now? You see what happened? This is what it did to it, right? It took it that way. Okay, so if we say top and we say 50 pixels, what will happen? You can see that, right? If we say left, and we say 100 pixels, right? So you can see, so that's literally what absolute position is all about. But that's the only position like we'll be explaining for this. So they actually for the sake of this video, we're actually sticking to that particular type of positioning, right? So let's quickly look at colors. There are several ways you can actually give colors, and before I proceed, if you want to put a comment in CSS, comments are basically code that don't execute, right? So the browser is not going to execute it. Whatever you write inside here is not going to execute, so you can use that to write basically notes, right? In your HTML file, this is how you can actually insert comments, right? So whatever you write in here, the web browser is not going to execute it, right? So that's how you can insert comments. So let us quickly look at something. Right? So let us look at colors, right? So you can actually specify a color with something like this, or there are several ways. We'll look at one particular one. Let's look at RGB. RGB stands for red, green, and blue. So its maximum value is 255, I believe. So let's say we say 50, and we say 100, and we say 230. Now you see that it's changing the colors, right? So if you look at this, you can see that it has changed that color, right? You can change that color. If I put this here 10 pixels, it's going to make that show even more, right? You can see that. So you can see that it's changing the color. If I put 200 here, and then I put 50 here, let's see what's going to happen. And then I say 100 here, you can see that that color has changed. right? So basically that's how you can use RGB to color elements, right? And then I'm actually going to get rid of this absolute because I don't want it down to this. Then I'll just put this here to 1 pixels, and then I'll just make this back to brown. So hit that to have this back, right? So basically that's how you can do that. But there's one more aspect of CSS we're going to look into, which is media queries, before we call this video, create for this at the end for this particular video. So basically, what are media queries? So you want to build a website, right? And you have to make sure that the website looks responsive, right? So if you're on a computer, it's going to have a look. But if you go to a mobile app, you go to a mobile device or a tablet, it's going to look differently. Like it's going to adjust to fit that screen. Let's look at this. So by the time I actually do this on this website, you can see how the website just adjusts itself to fit like for a mobile, right, or for a smaller device. So that's what we're talking about, responsive design. That's what responsive design is all about. Bootstrap successfully handles that for us, but we'll just quickly look at one or two things, right, that we can use to show responsive, write responsive code on CSS, right? So let's look at something. Let's do something now. We look at this nav, right? Right now, this is what we have. We have this nav. So let's write some responsive code, right? And let's just do a very basic one. So let's say at media. So that's when you want to write responsive code, right? At media screen. Sorry about that. At media screen, right? And min height, right, is, let's say, 500 pixels, right? So let's say we have at media screen. This is what basically we're trying to say, right? So we are saying that if the minimum height, no, let's use width, please. Let's use width because I want to really show. So let's change this to width, right? Width, right? I will say this is what's basically saying if the minimum width of the device is 500 pixels, right? So let's say this nav as it is like this should have a border color of yellow, right? So if the minimum width is 500 pixels, right? So it should have a border of yellow, right? Now let's look at what this looks like. So you can see that the border color is yellow, and that's because the minimum width of this screen is actually larger, it's longer than 500 pixels. But let's do something. If we do inspect, you can see that that's turned back to brown because it's lower than that. By the time I begin to expand this, you can see that the color is changing. So this is a basic way, this is just a basic introduction of basic way of explaining responsiveness. So this is how you can actually make sites responsive using CSS. But when we get into the Bootstrap part, we see how we can use Bootstrap to streamline all these things and then make it very, very easy for us, right? So that is that on CSS. We hope you learned a lot from the CSS video, and then see you in the next video.